Hello and welcome back to this run through the whole of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. This video is the second part of Book 1. If you haven't seen the first part of Book 1, it's best to go back and watch that before you watch this one, otherwise you might not be able to follow the discussion. Okay, so what did we see in the first part of Book 1? We saw that Aristotle is looking for the supreme good, the Tom Ellis of activities. What is it that all our activities aim at? He's also discarded a couple of possibilities as to what this end of all activities could be. He said it's not going to be pleasure, it's not going to be honour, it's not going to be wealth. It's going to be something he calls flourishing, which we haven't understood yet, but we know that it is a technical term that has to do with a sense of satisfaction with a life well lived. In the background, he's also given us some major ideas that influence his thinking that are going to be important for the whole book. One is that human beings are social animals. When he talks about politics, he doesn't really mean what we understand nowadays as politics, but the life of living together, which is fundamental to what human beings are like. In the same way that horses live in a herd or lions live in a pride, human beings live together in a state, and the function of that state is determined by the fact that we are social animals. That all our activities have purposes. We engage in purposeful activities, activities that lead towards an end, that try to achieve a goal. And that finally, ethics is an imprecise science. This is a really important point, because the aim of the book is not to give a rigid, precise, narrow answer to how should I live my life, but because ethics is a complex, diverse, difficult subject, the answer is going to be similarly complex, diverse and imprecise. Okay, so what happens next in the second part of Book 1? We have the function argument, one of the most important arguments in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and also one of the most controversial arguments. What does the function argument say? Well, it says, look at any specific activity or function. It has a goal, it aims at something. Let's say I am a sculptor. You immediately understand that what I am engaged in while I sculpt is to produce sculptures. It would be really bizarre for me to say, I am a sculptor, and in answer to what you do, what is the end of this activity, I would say nothing. I just don't move at all. In that sense, I'm not really a sculptor. So to sculpt is to produce sculptures. And if an activity has an end, then what counts as being good at that activity is determined by the end. Being a good sculptor is determined by the kind of sculptures you produce. If you produce excellent sculptures, then you are an excellent sculptor. This is the basis of the function argument. So if this is true, if activities have a function, and if to be good at that activity, you need to be excellent at producing the function of that activity or fulfilling the function of that activity, then what is the function of human beings? Now he thinks the function of human beings is going to be unique to them. So he looks at other beings around us and what they do, and then he tries to find what it is that distinguishes us from other beings. So in a sense, we're alive and we grow and we take on nutrition, but this is something that plants do as well, so it's not unique to us. And we're also sentient beings, but again, this is not unique to us because animals are also sentient. What is the one thing that distinguishes us from the plants and the animals and everything else around us? It's the ability to reason. So this must be the function of human beings because it is unique to us. And what is it? To be a good human being, well, like a good sculptor, is to fulfill the function, therefore to reason well. So now we have an answer to what is the flourishing life, what is the supreme good at which everything aims at. Well, that is to reason well. And Aristotle says that the good for man is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. This is his formal definition now of flourishing. Be a little bit careful here with virtue because it doesn't exactly mean what we take it to mean nowadays. It's a much wider concept that might include intellectual as well as moral abilities. The rest of the book will come to tell us what a virtue is, so we'll give content to this idea of the flourishing life. But underlying all this is the function argument. The idea that human beings have a function, that function is unique to us, and it is to reason and to be a good specimen of a human being to fulfill that function, to reason well. Okay, we'll spend a little bit of time here on criticisms of the function argument, although we don't have time to fully engage with every single one of them. It is a very widely discussed argument in the literature, and I think it's the kind of thing you need to go and read secondary literature objections to it to fully appreciate it. One of the biggest criticism is, why should we assume that we have a function? Now you need to understand here that Aristotle is writing at the end of a long tradition of thinking teleologically. Telos in Greek means an end, and here teleologically characterizes the types of theories that believe that there is an end, that there is something that we aim towards. Sometimes teleology is used in other ways, but this is how the term is defined here. So Aristotle has a teleological theory that comes after many other thinkers before him have thought in teleological manner. And one of the objections is, why should we assume that human beings have any function whatsoever? It seems to have assumptions that we were made for a specific purpose with that function ingrained in our nature. Therefore, anybody who doesn't believe in a God who made us in that particular way has no reason to accept this kind of argument. And it also perhaps is vulnerable to the idea that we evolved and that evolution is pretty much a matter of chance, depending on the kind of environments we come across, the kind of a species that were able to evolve fast enough to fit into the types of environments they came across. And that seemed like a chance process rather than an intentional process that had an end or a meaning imposed to it by an external being, possibly. I'm not too sure, I mean, this is an interesting objection, but I'm not too sure it's a correct objection, because Aristotle's notion of function here is not a narrow one and it's not given from the outside. If it is a part of nature, it could have been a part of nature that simply evolved in us due to the circumstances that we found ourselves in, how our ancestors evolved in a particular way. So it's not incompatible with evolution, nor does it require somebody external to have given this function to us, because of what it is. To think, to reflect, to reason is an ability that is self-reflective, that allows you to ask, are these good reasons, the reasons that I have at this particular moment? So there is no specific content to this function. It's not like me saying, my end is Tom Ellis, and you saying, not really interested in him at all, I'm interested in George Clooney. So it's not that kind of thing. He's not giving us a specific thing that we aim for. He's giving us a reflective ability that is part of who we are. And the very moment you engage into this critical discussion of whether Aristotle got it right or wrong, or whether indeed we have a function, you're engaging in reflection in a way that is quite distinctive of human beings. You are, in a sense, by thinking about Aristotle, behaving in a way that he said is characteristic of the type of being that you are. And in a sense, the whole of philosophy is concerned with reasons, arguments, and the importance of reflection and self-reflection. So he's not saying something that is quite dramatically divorced from anything that anybody has said before and after him. Okay, why is it unique? That is another objection. Why couldn't it be something that we share with other animals, perhaps, or with aliens that arrive from abroad, from another planet, not abroad as such? Okay, so why does it have to be unique? This is perhaps a more substantial objection, but it's also not that particularly important to the argument. He identifies the function of human beings by contrast with other animals, but I'm not sure he's necessarily committed to the idea that it has to be unique to us. If it turned out that another animal had this capability to reason, then perhaps they could also share in a flourishing life. And keep in mind here that the flourishing life is not prescriptive. He has not yet said that you ought to behave in ABC way in order to flourish. All he has said that it is in accordance with reason. So it is left for reason to determine the content of the flourishing life. And as we'll see, this can be done in a variety of different ways. Now, is there another problem here? Is he confusing the idea that when you're good at something, like when you're good at sculpting, whether this is a different thing from the fact that sculpting would be good for you? It is very possible to say that somebody was a very good painter. Van Gogh was a very good painter, but his creative and artistic abilities seem to be inexorably linked with some mental and emotional problems that were definitely bad for him. So you could say that he was a good painter, he was good at painting, but painting was not good for him. It would have been better for him had he stopped painting. Perhaps he would have found a greater sense of well-being and emotional health from stopping being a painter. So is Aristotle confusing these two things here, being good at something and that thing being good for you? Well, here it depends how much weight you put on the naturalistic element of the function argument. For Aristotle, the fact that this is how we are naturally, that we reason naturally, is a very significant part of his theory. When he reflects on how we're like as human beings, we're not just stones. Do you remember there's a lecture where we talk about how the difference between agents and stones? We are the kinds of things that have intentions and motives and voluntary agency, that perform actions because these actions have been chosen, but we can also reflect on what it is that we choose to do. Reflection is part of choice, choice is part of agency, agency is part of responsibility, responsibility is central to morality. This is a huge package. You can decide to reject all of it, and there are philosophers who do, but it is a package of things that are interrelated in a significant way for many, many philosophers. Okay, so we're going to stop there with the objections to the function argument. I know we haven't resolved anything, but we're not going to be able to resolve this thing in 5 minutes. There's quite a lot that you are, if you want to, if you are interested, that you are able to read on the function argument and its objections, and the discussion becomes quite complicated. But what does Aristotle do next? Next thing is he reminds us this is just a rough sketch of how things are, and that the details will be filled in later. So the whole book is going to be an answer to what is the function of human beings, what is it to reason well and to be an excellent specimen of a human being, what is it to flourish. But also he wants us again to remember, as he did earlier on, that we mustn't expect more precision from the answer than the subject matter ethics allows for, and it doesn't allow for a lot of precision. Then he makes another important point, that this supreme God that we've just the supreme good that we've just uncovered, it's not just the possession of virtue, but it is activity in accordance with virtue. He's now giving us some hints about moral virtue that are going to come later on. He's going to develop these arguments in more detail, but one hint is activity. The other hint is that to be virtuous is not just to find pleasure in the results that one brings about, but to find virtue pleasurable in itself. And the third hint is that flourishing requires external resources. This is a really important part of Aristotelian theory, that our lives, that the way in which our lives can become flourishing, can go well, is dependent on a lot of external factors that are subject to chance. For example, help from our friends, or even the very availability of friends, political influence, by which he might mean the state in which you're born in and how the state helps you flourish. And then he comes up with a variety of things which might be a bit surprising, but being ugly, being of low birth, being solitary or childless are all disadvantages which can mar our flourishing. So flourishing requires prosperity. Now, obviously, this is quite contentious, but I'm not going to say more on this because it comes up again and again. And I think you need to appreciate the importance of this idea that Aristotle has, that our lives are vulnerable, that the flourishing life is dependent on a variety of many different things that are open to chance, that all these things have to go right for our lives to be flourishing. So then he asks, can flourishing be learned? Is it something that can be cultivated over time? Or is it a gift of the gods given to us by chance? Now he says here that since flourishing is natural, and this is where you see the importance of the function argument, flourishing comes from how we are by nature, and it is what is best. It must be widely shared because our nature is widely shared. It must be the kind of thing that we can find in everyone. It can't be defined as something that is elitist or excludes most of the natural specimens of this kind, since it is in our nature. And it must be something that you can win by your own efforts, because it comes from you, it comes from your nature. It must be possible for you to achieve flourishing through what you do because of who you naturally are. And therefore, it can't be something that is allocated by chance. A lot of stuff on luck here. Luck plays an enormous part in Aristotelian ethics and is very complicated. So, the summary of these ideas, and this is looking forward to a lot of the Nicomachean Ethics and also some of the other works of Aristotle, is that you can't flourish purely by chance. It can't be that the gift of a good life is given or taken away purely by chance, because it is part of your nature. But what is part of your nature is the aptitude for this, not the fully realized good life. So everybody has this aptitude, we all share it because of our nature, but how it is developed over time and cultivated through an entire life, that is vulnerable to luck. It's a long journey and some things can go wrong because we can't control every aspect of it. Quite a lot happening again here in this first part, in the second part of the first book. He moves on to yet another idea that we've seen glimmers of. What is the aim of politics? Remember, by politics he doesn't mean what we understand, but he means a state, a social organization where people come together whose purpose is to help its citizens arrive at virtue and to help them become ready to perform fine, good, virtuous deeds. It's a community project. It is one where other people are going to help you achieve the good life. And animals and children are barred from this good life because they just don't have the fully developed ability to reason. Animals will never get it, children will develop it through a complete life. But, and here he comes to an important bit that goes on for quite a while, we cannot have a flourishing life, and we cannot call a life flourishing until it gets to its end, because things may go wrong. And one of the things that may go wrong are the bad fortunes, for example, of Priam. Priam is the king of Troy. He was supposed to be a wise and virtuous man who didn't in any way contribute to the bad decisions that led to the Trojan Wars and to the fall of Troy. But despite doing the best he could under really bad circumstances, ended up devastated by what was happening around him. He lost his city-state, his citizens were killed and murdered, taken as slaves, his sons died, he saw everything that he had worked for burnt to the ground. So that kind of man who was virtuous can't have said to have lost his virtue, but he has lost some aspect of happiness. How is that possible? Well, there is a very complicated picture here that foreshadows a lot of the things that he's going to explain later on in the book. But he thinks that virtue is a disposition. It is a character trait. So it's stable and long-running. It is the kind of thing that you have for a long time. You don't have a moment of virtue that is then extinguished, that can then come back. It is a stable disposition throughout your entire life. But having said that, it can be affected by bad and good luck. Small misfortunes and small bits of good luck can be accommodated or overcome, in the same way that a really good craftsman can produce a good object, even if the materials and the tools that he's given are poor. In fact, you only know that somebody's a good craftsman sometimes when they're tested, when they're given poor material and they still produce something good. In the same way, the virtuous person can accommodate small misfortunes and bad things happening in their lives. But sometimes the misfortune is completely overwhelming, and that's the example of a person like Priam, all of whose external resources, friends, state, have been devastated by extreme bad luck. Now, to an extent, Priam doesn't become vicious because he doesn't perform vicious deeds because of what happened to him. He is still a virtuous man, but his flourishing, the aspect of his virtue that has to do with his overall happiness and satisfaction with his life, is marred by bad fortune. This is quite a complicated argument. Again, you have to wait until later in the book to understand all of it. Okay, from that he moves on and he says, is flourishing a relative or an absolute good? And of course would expect him to say, which he does, that it is an absolute good because it is not valued in relation to anything else. It is the supreme good, valuable in and of itself, not because of what it brings about. And finally, he concludes with the argument that sets us up for what is to follow. So since flourishing is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, the rest of the book will examine what is virtue. And since this is flourishing for human beings that concerns us, the psychology of human beings is really important here. For a long time, philosophers moved away from psychology as irrelevant to the kinds of questions that we ask. But for Aristotle, and for those contemporary philosophers who have taken inspiration from Aristotle, we ought to go back to a closer collaboration with what psychologists have found. Because psychology looks at human nature, and how we are is very important, how we should live. It determines what counts as a good life for the type of beings that we are. Back to the flourishing argument. Yeah, that's why Aristotle looks at the soul. He looks at the psychology of the soul, and he says that the soul has two parts: the rational part, that's reason, reflection, being amenable to reasons, and an irrational part. The irrational part of the soul has itself two components. The first component has to do with the vegetative parts of the soul, with dealing with things like nutrition and growth, the kind of things that continue to function even if we're asleep and not aware of them in any way. And these things have no relation to reason. They just are. They're part of our psychological makeup and they move us in certain ways without being subject to reason. If you're hungry, you're just hungry. No amount of thinking about it is going to make you less hungry, and you can't give yourself reasons to be less hungry. You're still going to be hungry. But there is another part of the soul, of the irrational part of the soul, the appetitive part, which is amenable to reason. That means it can kind of listen to reason if the circumstances are right. He talks here about the way in which we can take into account somebody's recommendations. So our father's recommendations or our friend's recommendations, the kind of things that might sway us. And because this person is our friend, what they recommend might have quite a lot of weight to sway us, more weight than the views of somebody that we've just met, for example. The irrational but appetitive part of the soul is amenable to reason in this kind of way. It is open to being guided by reason, but as we shall see, there are many conditions that determine whether it will be, in this particular case, listening to reason or not. What makes reason persuasive, and what makes the appetitive part of the soul more open to the suggestions of reason or not, is a huge topic and a very interesting topic in Aristotle that ties back to claims about our psychology as human beings. Because the soul is divided into the rational and the irrational part, the virtues have a corresponding division between intellectual virtues, the virtues of the mind, and moral virtues. The rest of the book primarily looks at moral virtues, states of character. And character is going to become, as a concept, extremely important to the rest of the book. But that is the end of book 1. Well done for making it so far. I know it's really hard going. A lot of it foreshadows arguments that are going to come later on in the book that are simply touched upon here and not really explained and not really defended. But that is one of the, I don't know what to call it, because for me it is a virtue of the book, but for now it might look like a disadvantage to you. But one of the disadvantages and at the same time virtues of the book is that you need to read all of it because before you can make sense of it. It presents a really global picture where everything falls together into place from a variety of different perspectives. Okay, I hope I can see you again for book 2.